Good afternoon. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues. My name is Alan Tate, and I'm standing in for Professor Brenda Gourlay, who is sadly unwell and unable to introduce Lord Putnam to you today. She sends her very best wishes both to Lord Putnam and to you all here at the Pan-Commonwealth Forum. So it is my privilege to introduce Lord Putnam, David Putnam, if I may, who is to give this most prestigious of addresses, the Asa Briggs Memorial Lecture, named, of course, after Asa Briggs, who did so much in the governance of the Open University and the establishment of the Commonwealth of Learning. Now to our speaker. You'll be familiar, I am sure, with David Putnam's outstanding career as a filmmaker, with celebrated movies such as Chariots of Fire, The Killing Fields, The Mission, Memphis Belle, and many others, and his winning of the Academy Award for Best Picture, as well as the Best Picture Award from BAFTA, where he was also recognised for his outstanding contribution to British cinema. He also ran Columbia Pictures, which is not, I am told, a job for the faint-hearted. However, you may be less familiar with the work of Lord Putnam. Elevated to the House of Lords in 1997, Lord Putnam has been very active in government and in public policy. He's worked in the field of education, media policy, climate change for more than 20 years, in too many roles to elaborate here, but notably for me as Chancellor of the Open University, where I had the privilege of working for him as Pro-Vice-Chancellor. In all Lord Putnam's work in education, he has had a particular focus on access, opportunity, and social justice, as well as on film and television. He chaired the world's first Climate Change Act activity in the House of Lords in 2008. And most recently, he's chaired the House of Lords Committee on the Impact of Digital Technologies on Democracy, which reported this year. You can find his educational values set out in full in the film he made, what else would he make except a film, with Michael Barber, called We Are the People We've Been Waiting For. You can find that on YouTube. It's well worth watching. So with great anticipation, I now give the floor to Lord Putnam for the Asa Briggs Memorial Lecture 2019.
Thank you, Alan, very much indeed. Distinguished guests. I think probably distinguished guests covers all of the Nigerian traditional welcomes. So as far as I could, oops, that doesn't. Asa Briggs, this is a very great honour for me because Asa was not just a wonderful man, and he was a wonderful man, he was a colleague in the House of Lords. And he was a very jovial man. Those of you who may have known him, he had a wonderful, wonderful sense of humour. I say that because if you detect a very slightly angry edge to some of the things I'm saying today, it's because there is a slightly angry edge to some of the things I'm saying today. A tiny story about Asa, and also in a sense, a tiny story about the House of Lords, which I was very proud of last week, incidentally. I was having tea there once, having quite a dispute with another colleague over an odd thing we may not know about, called the Great Stink. The Great Stink was the smell in Victorian London that drove the House of Lords into recess, so House of Lords and the House of Parliament into recess, and which, as a result, they developed the entire world's first, actually, sewage system. This was developed at colossal cost, and people said it couldn't be done, but it did get one. And we were having an argument, and it so happened at that moment, Asa walked past. And Asa, as you know, was the great Victorian historian. And I asked him to come over, and he sat down. And I said, could you just answer this one question, Asa? It was about the price of the sewage system in London. We then got a 40-minute lecture on Victorian London, on entrepreneurship, and on why, actually, we, in this day and age, are absolute wimps when it comes to taking on enormous challenges which appear to be insuperable. So I owe Asa a great deal as a colleague and as a friend, and it's as I say, it's a privilege to deliver this lecture in his name. I Alan's just mentioned that I chaired the parliamentary committee that took through the world's first climate change bill in 2008. And I do see the challenges and issues relating to climate change as not a million miles away from the challenges that I want to talk about today. And I'll come back to that a little later, but I think there are more similarities than not. And there we go. This is really what I want to talk about: the scale of the challenge, the opportunity, and the threat. And I have to say, in preparing this lecture, I found it extremely difficult, because every time you look at the scale of the challenge and you look at the mitigation opportunities we have, it appears that the gap lengthens, is greater, not narrower. And that's very demoralizing. It's similarly demoralizing when you look at the climate change challenge. So there are more similarities, I say, than not. Here's the International Labour Organization last year did a snapshot of the world's working population. And I found it really, really interesting. Employed 3.3 billion out of 5.7. This line outside of extended labour force, 2 billion. That is very largely family businesses, which is interesting, because the opportunity to develop within the education world in that area is obvious. Then you have the unemployed, 172 million, and the potential labour force of 140 million. So that's the way the International Labour Organization sees the world's population vis-à-vis work. And it's not a particularly happy story. It's not a particularly happy story because we're looking at the changes in the working place, which are very, very dramatic. By 2030, 50% of all current work could be automated. If you doubt that, I'd recommend to you a very, very good Netflix film. I think came out last week or the week before. The very first film produced by President Obama's company. It's simply called Factory, and it's well worth looking at. It's about the closure of a factory by General Motors in the United States. It's being taken over by new Chinese owners, and the ramifications of that to the workforce. I found it an extraordinary, a very moving film, actually. And here's the issue. Up to 375 million displaced workers are likely to require new skills. And that, I would argue, is where we come in. Rising rate of automation. This is a rather crude slide, but it's the best I could get hold of. 2018, 71% of humans were unaffected, relatively unaffected. 2022, 58%. More people would be affected by the machine and the opportunities of the machine in 2025 than work, as it were, in non-machine related areas. That's a quite chilling concept. Many adults do not have the right skills for emerging jobs. You all know this. 6 out of 10 adults lack basic ICT skills or have no computer experience whatsoever. So this is the situation as we move into 2020. I created this slide and I find it interesting, and some of you, when we come to questions, might wish to argue this. But I took 5 hierarchies of work and the notion of future mobility. Top 3 hierarchies are relatively safe. They're also, needless to say, the smallest. The really interesting ones is the bottom 2 boxes, particularly the operational box. For every reason, we have to move that operational box up to join those top 3. For 2 reasons, really. One is literally equity. These people, if they can be reskilled, have a real future. But the other is that the top 3 won't survive without that workforce. So it's in everyone's interest, national interests, business interests, corporate interests, to ensure that the retraining operation that's required at that operational level is carried out as effectively and as speedily, frankly, as possible. And another way of looking at it is this. 54% of companies are set to reskill employees in their key roles. Only 33% are set to reskill employees at risk of technological disruption. In other words, those most in need of reskilling and upskilling are least likely to receive any such training. And I find that quite alarming. Source of that is the World Economic Forum last year. Rose Luckin is Professor of Learning Centre Education at UCL and a colleague of mine. I'm working with her on a number of things. She said this: No one's got to grips with the required strategic planning for educational change in this context, and there's a dire need for it. And here, my first sort of note of criticism, if you like. My own experience of educational change stumbles very, very quickly at the moment of educationalists themselves. The education world is change resistant. That may be an uncomfortable notion, but it's true. It's quite uncomfortable with the notion of change. Two examples, I think quite vivid. I teach from home in Ireland at 7 universities around the world. I teach using a Cisco telepresence system. I teach seminars, 20 hours of seminars in 7 universities. When I started doing it in 2012, the biggest obstacle was nervousness or reluctance amongst the universities who had already appointed me to help me fulfill this. Why? Because they sort of saw it as the thin end of the wedge. They thought, well, maybe if this is going to catch on, who knows, it could be my job that could suffer. The reality is that I can only be as successful as the people I have in the room at the other end. If I've got a great colleague who keeps that class going, who challenges me and creates that dialogue and that electricity, if you like, we will have great seminars. Failure at the other end makes it almost impossible for me to do other than recite poetry. So the dynamic's very important. And another slightly maybe more amusing fact, I'm of a generation that remembered the very first radio. I doubt there's anyone else here, maybe John Daniels, the very first radio being wheeled into my classroom. I remember it quite vividly. And someone waiting until it was exactly 10 o'clock, and I switched it on, and a voice boomed out from the BBC, "Good morning, children. This is your," whatever it was. We thought it was great, but there was incredible consternation in the staff room. Again, the staff saw this as the beginning of the end of their teaching careers, that this was going to become absolutely normal. They'd become sort of clerks or whatever it is, and all the teaching was done by the BBC over the radio. Well, what arrant nonsense that turned out to be. But that was the instinct. And always also remember, John will back me up on this, the Open University was created despite government support. I worked for Harold Wilson, briefly. He was an elderly man, but in the last year of Prime Minister, I worked for him. And I discussed this with him, honestly, on a number of occasions. When he looked around the cabinet table seeking support, he got none. In fact, in his memoirs, I think he talks about the fact that Roy Jenkins, really eminent Home Secretary, said, "In the end, Harold, we won't oppose you because you're entitled to a project as Prime Minister, but we think this is barking mad." Why? Because they were all university graduates, and the idea of universal access to university education offended them. Far from embracing it. So the OU battled past official support at cabinet level and relied entirely on Jenny Lee and Jenny Lee's relationship with Harold Wilson to push it through. It would be a terrible mistake to ever forget that. To somehow think that the OU was a child of government, a benign government, would be an error. It forced its way through. It forced its way onto the agenda. And I'd argue that many of the things that we in this room want to do will have to force their ways onto the agenda. They will not be politely offered the stage. And I don't enjoy saying these things, incidentally. These are tough realities. And Rose Luckin's right. There is a dire need for change. Which leads me to the title of my lecture today. I called it The Fifth Day. And I realise this is an extraordinarily simplistic notion, but in the future, the normal working week could be 4 days of work and 1 day of study, training, or retraining. And in one way or another, I'd argue that this will happen. I'm not saying it'll happen 4 days a week, 1 day a week, but the normal employment contract, the normal expectation at work will be that the training, the reskilling, and the upskilling for the next job will be part and parcel of this job. There's nothing extraordinary about that. So I think the fifth day is not a bad means of communicating that idea. And speaking of communication, I was a filmmaker for many, many, many years, and I believe Plato got it exactly right. Those who tell the stories rule society. So my next question is, how good are we as educators in getting our narrative across? And again, I'd argue, not that good. education is still seen as a being done to, not as sharing, not as part of a really, really full and fulfilled life. It's something that's done to you. And too many of the young people that we teach and engage with see it that way. And that's an error in our narrative. I'm using a very simple example of what I mean. It's very interesting being here in Edinburgh, and most particularly at Murrayfield. I love sport. I really love sport. And I spent 7 years as the very, very happy president of UNICEF UK. And we did an enormous amount of work using sport to get to people, I think in interesting ways. And one of the devices that we promoted was this very simple $350 piece of technology called the white line machine. Point there is that the white light machine turns chaos into order in a way that almost nothing else can. And it is extraordinary. Here's a little marvelous statistic. 20 years ago, not one single African player played in the Premier League. Today, 100 African players are contracted to Premier League teams. 30 of them are playing regularly every Saturday. That sounds like a tiny number, but try to imagine what an inspiration that is for children throughout Africa thinking that could be them. And now we've got women's leagues. It becomes even more exciting. So this notion is this simple piece of technology, the white line machine, transforms lives. It's something I think is really useful, because if you begin to see what the potential is for taking a daft, small idea and changing things, that's, I think, a wonderful example. The other was touched on earlier, Asa mentioned it, about how long we're going to live and what we're doing. I made a film for the Irish government, a series of films, 4 films, 3 years ago, where I looked at the changes in education, and I looked particularly at the changes being brought about by education. Here's a very, very short clip from it, and what I'd ask you to do, look at the reaction of the kids to what I'm saying to them. There's something like 70% of the jobs that you'll be doing 15 years from now do not at present exist. We don't even know what they are. So you need to be collaborative, flexible, smart, and absolutely able to adapt to change. So what I think the school's trying to prepare you for, I hope, and in fact I know it, is a world of constant change. I'm 75 years old. I'm learning stuff every single day, and I do it by teaching. Now, my father had retired 10 years earlier. I've got another 10 years in me, at least. Some of you in this room will be working at aged 100. I promise you. I promise you. So just think about this. It's a very, very, very different gig. And what the school's doing is preparing you for that, which is fantastic. I don't know how many of them believe me, but I promise you, as I promised them, there will be people born today who will be working aged 100. And that will probably involve several different careers. This is, I think, very interesting. Most economists acknowledge that technological progress can cause adjustment problems in the short run. What's really noted is that the short run can be a lifetime. And ultimately, the long run depends on policy choices made in the short run being today. We cannot afford to think too far that somehow these short-termism is something that we'll get past, and we'll walk into a marvellous future. And this is entirely recognised by Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. So the biggest issue may be how to institutionalise retraining in mid-career and to integrate it with the social welfare system. Big, big, big challenges. How's it going to happen? John Harris in The Guardian the other day. Any convincing answer to technological disruption lies not in trying to deny the future, but in coming up with changes to education that might protect people and allow them to make the most of these huge changes. And what's that account to? That's teachers and teaching. This is a lovely GIF I nicked this weekend from the internet. But I believe this passionately. Any country that fails to value its teachers fails to value its own future. Now that sounds to all of us here, I'm sure, utterly obvious. But for many, many, many people, it's inobvious. It is a huge, huge challenge. And where the teachers are going to come from, that's another entire issue. Quality of teachers is another very, very important factor. There was a lovely film that came out last year called Science Fair. Talked about kids competing with ideas in science. And I was particularly struck by this one teacher in an American school. And what she said about our own pupils and listen to the very first words, because they're important.
I'm going to be so proud when one of my kids win a Nobel Prize, because they will. One of them will.
I would ask you, how many of us in this room ever had a teacher who started a year saying, I expect one of you to win a Nobel Prize? What a brilliant... You did? Fantastic. Well, book her for next conference. What a fantastic challenge. To actually have a teacher that expects that one of you in a class is going to win a Nobel Prize. Not a bad place to start from. And I wonder, are we ambitious enough for our young people? Are we... She says, I come down on them. A few years ago, when I was working for the government, we found a school in the north of England that had 100% record in O-level maths, 100%. And I was dispatched off to go and see him, spend some time with him. And he was a very nice man, very modest man. I said, what's the secret? What's the juice? Can you tell us? He said, it was so easy. It's very, very simple. He said, beginning of the year, I tell them I'm available every Saturday here. And any of them are worried or feel they're not making the grade, come in and spend Saturday with me and I'll help you. No child's ever walked through that door on a Saturday that hasn't passed an exam. Ever. So the challenge is actually challenging a kid to know that if they'll put in the effort, you'll be there for them and they'll pass. And I brought that message back. I don't know how well it went down at the Department of Education. They all suddenly thought the idea that I was suggesting they might all work Saturdays, so it probably didn't go down very well. But it was a fascinating insight. Teachers, here's just a little example. In India, I got this from McKinsey's, demand for teachers will grow by 208% by the mid-2020s. 208%. To me, it doesn't sound possible. But if India is to achieve its own ambitions, it's going to have to find an extraordinary number of teachers. There's a few other countries, but India is the one with the outstanding challenge. China, indeed, has also got problems. So education in the developing world, it is changing. We are managing to make it change, but it's changing, I would argue, too slowly, and in a world that in turn is changing at a very, very rapid pace. OU. I was its fifth chancellor, the bride-to-be. Asa Briggs was its third. I think we've got quite a lot in common, but the interesting thing for me, whether I liked it or not, is I was there at the point of the digital transformation. Literally, when Brenda retired, Martin Bean arrived, the university was going through the process of moving from television to a television-based delivery system to a digital-based delivery system, and that was painful. It didn't come easily for the staff, didn't come easily for the technology. It was an enormous moment of change. It's a wonderful thing that I was able to hand on to Martha Lane Fox, who is digital to her eyebrows and doesn't even ask the questions that I often make myself a fool over. The other thing I say about the OU, any of you who have not experienced, and many of you have, I'm sure, have not experienced an open university graduation ceremony are really missing out. It is the most exciting, exhilarating, emotional thing you can ever be part of. Because these are not people who have any expectation over a period of 3-4 years of graduating. These are people who have worked on their kitchen table, night after night, with other people looking after the childcare responsibilities. This is a magnificent achievement across that stage at the OU. And I, frankly, used to go out of my way, and probably John did as well, go out of my way to whip it up as much as possible. The idea that this was a somber occasion was anathema to me. These were massive celebrations, and if you ever get half a chance to attend one, I beg you, it's much better than anything you'll ever see on television. Asa, basically largely responsible for this extraordinary figure, you're familiar with these, 8 million learners. This is with Futurelearn. We would not have ever, I think, had the courage to develop Futurelearn had it not been off the back of a lot of Asa's writing. Over 8 million learners, 230 territories, 155 global partners, and provides a platform for the Institute for Coding, which was brought in by my successor, Martha Lane Fox. It's a remarkable achievement. Here's a little bit about Futurelearn, but I'll talk about it more in a moment.
Imagine a world where the highest quality learning is open to all. regardless of status, location, or circumstances. That's what we're building. We're Futurelearn. Our purpose is to transform access to education. We're a pioneer. We're owned by the Open University, a world leader and world first in distance education, with over 50 years' experience. We've reached over 8 million learners to date. We're a multi-award-winning team, with the skills, passion and plan to deliver the best learning experience. We offer a huge selection of courses from over 160 leading universities and cultural institutions all over the world. We make learning simple, one step at a time, on mobile, tablet and desktop, so you can fit your learning around your life.
Now, you've heard what's going on in Nigeria, which I found to be incredibly impressive, but it is about communication, it is about marketing to a degree. And one of the things I think we have to learn from the private sector as quickly as we can is about marketing, is about the process of outreach, because exactly the same people we're trying to reach are also being reached by Google and any number of other, and Amazon and any number of other organizations. And I'm not sure, again, that our marketing is as good as it might be, partly because we're slightly resistant to the idea. Somehow we know that the product we're offering, education, shouldn't need selling. But the truth is, sadly, it does. Here's a wonderful short film when Futurelearn partnered up with the European Space Agency and provided what I think is an exemplary promotional piece of tool.
Welcome to the first Asa MOOC on Earth observation from space.
I love that because I think it's masterful in the way it connects a really very, very academic subject to our day-to-day concerns and worries and the way that we might access the information that will help us. This is the oddest slide I've got here. Ridley Scott. Ridley was one of a number of us, 5 or 6 of us, in the late 60s, early 70s that went into the film industry. He's probably most successful, 132 film credits, 4 Oscar nominations, a big business in Los Angeles and a large business in London. The other day I was speaking to him, I did his first movie. Chatting to him the other day, and I knew that Ridley had gone to the Royal College of Art. So I'd always quietly assumed that of all of us, he was kind of the one with the finest education. Gone to a very, very good college. And out of the blue, he said to me, well, you know, I only got 1 O-level. I said, well, yeah, art. He said, I got art, no level. I said, how on earth did you get to the Royal College of Art? Oh, he said, very simple. My art teacher sent me up there for an interview, and I took my portfolio with me, and I showed it to the provost and others, and they accepted me and gave me a full grant. Now, this is the early 1960s. And I thought to myself, that couldn't happen today. Certainly couldn't happen today in the UK. Could not happen. This man would have ended up, as he put it, he'd have ended up as an engine driver because he rather liked the idea of driving engines. It was a teacher who suggested his art work was so good that he should go to the Royal College, and the Royal College accepted that, didn't ask him if he did maths, didn't ask him how proficient he was at history, brought him in as a student, and he must have created, this is not a joke, several 100,000 jobs as one man, as well as having a stellar career. And it begs the question, and I leave it open, have we really got education right? Do we make the right judgments in the right way about the right people at the right time? I don't know, but I think the important thing is we constantly ask ourselves that question, and don't for one second think that somehow we've got some cookie-cutter answer that's providing us with the very best people that we need to see our way through the next 2 or 3 decades. Coal, as you heard brilliantly from Asa, knows this. It knows it's about people. It knows it's about success stories, and it knows that a lot of these success stories can be extraordinarily improbable. And these are just a series of triumphs, individual triumphs, personal triumphs, all made possible, one way or another, by an engagement with coal. So I'm very, very proud of my relationship with them and to be on the... This is what's been achieved in numbers, and all these slides are available to anyone that wants them. But here's the issue. We have so much more to do. We're in the lowlands. The mountain is colossal. Do you remember Nelson Mandela's wonderful line from his autobiography? I climb the mountain from time to time and look around, and I look up, and there's so much more to climb ahead. And I try to remember that all the time. The key is to plan for, to mitigate against, and to optimize, as I said. That's the question. And here we come back slightly, if you like, the good news, to climate change. Taking ambitious climate change action could generate over 65 million new low-carbon jobs by 2030. That's not from me, that's the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate last year, their report. We could generate extraordinary jobs, worthwhile jobs, and at the same time save ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. Jobs created in wind and solar PV alone are enough to replace the jobs lost in the fossil fuel industry. So when you hear the big fossil fuel companies saying that it's the end of the world, as they see it, if we somehow or other close them down, not true. We have the capacity and we have the technology to replace those jobs. I'm rapidly coming to the end, but I want to talk about other interesting things that are taking place. The other day I went and visited LinkedIn. LinkedIn Learning, they bought lynda.com, pretty successful distance learning organization, and they're growing it very, very quickly using data. 14,500 courses, and they're damn good courses, and they're well-marketed courses, but they're expensive courses. At $25, just under, way, way, way out of the pocketbooks of most of the people that we deal with. But I just want to, again, briefly show you, they are very well marketed. Here's a nice video from them.
I got started in educational technology through, one day I was in an office and a friend of mine actually dragged one image from one program to another. Completely blew my mind. I then decided that, you know what, this maybe is career. This could be what I want to do. And I was teaching PE at the time, having played professional basketball and gone through that journey. And so I decided then, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. So just so happened, as things would happen, 2 or 3 days later, a lady came to me who was the head of IT and said that she was pregnant. And she just happened to mention that she wasn't telling anybody yet, and that if I wanted the job, then I would have time to actually work toward the job. So what I did was I went to every single department in the school, and I asked them, look, if you had to have an internet or intranet site, what would you have on it? And luckily enough for me, all of them thought, oh, okay, this is the kind of content I would have, so they gave it to me. So I spent the next year in the library teaching myself how to build and how to create internet content. So what then happened was when the job came up, it was a natural progression that I went for the interview, got the job, because I was already doing what they were going to hire somebody to do. So I think that was one of the fantastic things about me and entering technology. I came in straight from the back door. The other thing was that I was speaking to a friend of mine literally a week later, and he said to me, you know what, I've got this computer that a friend has, and he doesn't want it anymore. And I was like, wow. So the guy pays something like £1,000, which is about almost $1,000, and he gave it to me for like £100. So I took it, and again, I spent a lot of time in the library teaching myself how to use it. I started, you know, and we ended up where we are today, loving every second of it.
Now, I'm a professional communicator for most of my life, making movies. That is communication. What was done there, he was given enough space to tell his story. There's nothing advertising about that. That's not a promo as we would normally expect it. That's someone being given the time and the space to tell their stories. Every single one of you in this room has people and knows people who have stories like that. But how often do you put them in front of a really good camera, beautifully shot, and allow them to tell their story? And then make that available, be it on YouTube or whatever else. The one thing we don't lack is the ability to get our stories out. That is the one huge development in the last 10 years. Story space, create narratives, give people an opportunity to identify. People can identify with that man, with what he did, how he did it, and the fact that he loves every minute of it. That's a wonderful piece of communication. LinkedIn is growing at an extraordinary rate, paid 106% growth in paid learners, but as I say, that's a pricey option. Our responsibility, I think, is to find low cost or lower cost alternatives using all the skills that really very well-run company does. Nearly finished. Crafting sound lifelong learning systems should be the key business imperatives, as well as important contribution to society and social stability. Now, why do I say that? Because of this rather sad slide that I'm going to finish with. This is 1965, Eric Hoffer, very, very fine futurologist. My feeling is that an energetic, skilled population deprived of its sense of usefulness will be an ideal setup for an American Hitler. We're living in an era where democracy is being questioned. We're living in an era where people are looking for simplistic answers to complex and difficult questions. If we don't create platforms and opportunities for all of our citizens, we will wreak the whirlwind, because they will not quietly sit around wasting their lives away. You've heard today about food shortages, nutrition shortages, issues, big issues. If we're to have the type of stable, sensible, educated, improving societies that every one of us dreams of, then we have to play a role in ensuring that the future is not run by populist people who thrive on ignorance. Thank you very much for listening to me.